And I suppose you think you're the one to do it.
What happens when Sauron takes back what is his?
I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf. I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend?
I could do that.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I hope you're sitting comfortably and doing well on this. In Berwick, it's a fine sunny evening. I hope it is where you are too. Today, we're going to be discussing an article or two articles by Curtis Yarvin, also known as Mencius Moldbug, which caused a lot of controversy online amongst this sort of political sphere. People were very upset by these articles, surprisingly so. Not so much in terms of that they shouldn't have had this reaction. It's just that, you know, he's a political blogger. He talks about elite theory and philosophy. And his comments generated a lot of anger, frustration. People were very upset. And so what I wanted to do today was just a kind of a brief stream, somewhat going into why I think people were so upset by this, and then move into what can we glean from it charitably. If we're taking his articles charitably, what things can we take from it to use for our own thought? Because I do think there are some very useful insights in there, which many of us would accept. But a lot of the problem is to do with the form that the articles take, or the way he's presenting his ideas. And this is something I think many people have commented on in the past, that Yarvin's writing style is not conducive to his ideas. They actually often obscure what he's trying to say. And additionally, they actually, what I hope to show, the way he chose to present the ideas in this article, the form of them actually turned a large portion of his audience against him, even though they would probably agree with his main point. So I think, or at least a large part of his main point. So I hope that through this we will be able to use it in a positive way, and take the good things, but also push beyond, in a sense, what he's trying to say. Before I do that, just say hello to some people that are tuning in. Hello, Vingle. Good to see you as always, my friend. We've got James Abney. Greetings, sir. Herlock Shomes. Absolutely wonderful name. We've got AI Shire Tory, star of Unpopular Opinions now, who has just launched a new series on his channel, which I would thoroughly recommend to everybody. And if you haven't seen his channel before, go and check out the stuff he's done previously as well. It's absolutely fantastic. He's a great YouTuber, and he's got a very open mind, an imaginative approach to things, which I really appreciate, and I think you'll enjoy it too. So check him out. And welcome to everybody who's watching, lurking in the background. You're very welcome, one and all. So without further ado, let's get into this. So the context of this, the first article, and you can find both of them linked in the description, was the overturning of the Roe v. Wade decision by the Supreme Court, which, I mean, the media presented it as overturning abortion rights across America. That isn't the case. Rather, it returned the decisions on abortion laws to the states effectively. And so what the states had on the statute books would become the law in those places. This was, for many on the right and beyond, you know, in the Christian sphere, the evangelical Christian sphere, seen as a great victory, because nobody had thought in their wildest dreams that Roe v. Wade would be overturned in this way, not at least this suddenly. And moreover, that because many of the states would ban abortion as a consequence, or have effectively abortion bans, that many babies would be saved that would otherwise have been aborted. And the in a climate where the government, the media, the education system, the corporations, the NGOs all tend towards one direction, or at least broadly in one direction, some kind of progressivism. To have a significant decision in America go towards what most conservatives wanted was an absolutely wonderful thing for many people. And they were celebrating and seeing this not just as an endpoint, but actually a decisive victory which could lead on to further reforms in this area. And so many of the pro-life lobby are actually seeing this as an opportunity to fight for more rights for unborn children across different states and hold state legislatures accountable on this issue. So now Republicans can't hide behind Roe v. Wade. Their bases are going to try and push them to prohibit abortion where it's possible. Now, whether that's going to happen or not, that's a different question, right? The Republicans, as we know, are not the party of the conservatives, really. And so we'll see. But it was seen as a victory. And it is in this context that Yarvin wrote his famous "You Can Only Lose the Culture War," which was published on the 11th of July. And effectively, one of the points that he makes in this article is that actually Roe v. Wade, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, wasn't a victory. It was a loss for the dissident right, or those who want to see this regime gone. And he tries to make this argument through an analogy, and he uses categories or archetypes from Tolkien's mythology, specifically the Lord of the Rings, to explain this point. Before getting into the article, I'll just give the further kind of background to this. So there was a significant backlash to this article, as you might expect. People were very critical of it. There was some very good takes or engagements with it. So I think the distributist, yes, I always get muddled between the distributist and the prudentialist. I know they're very different, but similar names, right? The distributist did a video on it, and I would recommend you all check that out if you're interested. But there was also just a lot of kind of Yarvin, this is classic Yarvin, right? We make one step forward and he's trying to make out we've made two steps backward. He's always trying to show us that actually when we do something good, we're actually losing. He's actually a force which is negative for us, that he's holding us back, or if we followed his ideas, we wouldn't make any progress. And actually, in a sense, he's promoting a form of containment. We might touch on that a little bit later. In response, again, to this backlash, in his most recent blog post, which is the Tolkien System of Social Rules, which was published 12 hours ago, he has further clarified, elucidated, and explained his ideas. And I think he has made it much easier to understand what he's trying to say. He's bolstered some parts of his argument. He's made it much more sympathetic to understand. But there's still some underlying issues that we might get into. And so what I'm proposing to do, I'm not going to take each article by itself and go through it bit by bit, but rather taking the overall points that he's making at their strongest, we'll then get into the analysis. So the analogy that Yarvin's using, well, he wants to categorize different groups, primarily within the American context, using species or archetypes from the Lord of the Rings. In the initial article, he divided the American people into hobbits and elves. Hobbits are those people that belong to red states, Republicans, essentially. They want to grill and have babies. They don't want to be bothered by other people, and they certainly don't want to rule. Indeed, they're incapable of ruling by the very fact that they just want to be left alone and live good lives. The elves live in blue states, democrat states, on the coasts, and Yarvin identifies himself as an elf. He believes that they want to live beautiful lives and pursue a vision of self actualization. This is because the elf is primarily a creature of modernity, whereas the hobbit belongs to maybe a form of life or a mode of life which is not um, cynically self-aware of itself, just wants is quite pure and honest and innocent and thus naive. The elf is fully modern and is aware of the relativity of their own worldview and actually wants to, as a consequence, is constantly wrestling with this idea of authenticity and attempts to bring to bear something beautiful from the self. I'm somewhat extrapolating, but I think that's where he's kind of going. And in this division, uh, there are there are further categories that he adds later. So he says that dwarves are those who work within a society, uh, orcs are those who do not work, and zombies, which, as far as I'm aware, are not a Tolkien category at all, um, are those who cannot work. Additionally, each of these classes can be high or dark. High elves or hobbits are those who are part of the regime or support the regime of the moment, whereas dark elves or dark hobbits are those working against it or want another regime. Now, Yarvin's basic premise here is that um, the hobbits, by their very nature, are unable to govern because of their outlook on life. They are and that is they do not want to rule other people. They just want to live contented lives and you know have a family, um, live wholesomely, follow their religion, such as Christianity or whatever. They are unable to rule because the people that are cut out to rule have a desire to rule, want to rule, and are willing to act strategically to rule. He makes the point that yes, the hobbits in America, the Red Wing states could easily by force overthrow the democratic states, right? Or he makes this kind of joke, the Republican voters all have guns, right? So they'll probably win any war. But as soon as they get into power, they probably give it away back to the elves because they do not have the will to power, essentially. Whereas the elves, with their uh, penchant for uh, their sense of superiority, believe that they have the right to rule, and they're willing to use the system to achieve that. They're not, their modern approach to life actually helps in this regard because um, they don't believe really in democracy for its own sake. Rather, they believe in democracy insofar as it gives them power. Whereas the hobbits, who are naive and believe in higher principles, well, such as liberty and freedom and representation by democratic means, by believing in democracy, they're kind of blinded as to how they can hack the system to achieve power. Um, Within this, Yarvin then makes the point, well, if hobbits are unable to rule, even if they got into a position of power, they could not rule. They also, when they attack the high elves of the moment, actually are causing trouble, because there are these dark elves, which he identifies as those elves who want to overturn the current regime and replace it. They want to replace it with because the current regime is incompetent. It's ineffective because it is anti-Hobbit. It wants to make every Hobbit into an elf through the process of education, for example. We'll extrapolate some of these ideas more fully later on. But in being anti-Hobbit, it's actually a bad regime, because hobbits should not become elves. They should not become creatures seeking to rule. They should be allowed to live out their lives with their own values. So, but alternatively, we shouldn't want a regime which is anti-elf, because hobbits are incapable of ruling. What we need is a regime which is run by elves, those who are suited to rule, which is pro-Hobbit and pro-elf. That's what he wants. And so what we need to do is form or build up the Dark Elves. And they are going to be the intellectual class, the artists, those who might infiltrate universities and the media. And in time, through their works, such as novels and works of art, they are going to shift the culture through making dissidents fashionable. They're going to make opposing the current order unfashionable, fashionable, because they will discredit the values and ideas underlying the current regime. This can only happen, though, if they're given the freedom to do so. When hobbits attack the regime, this causes a kind of strengthening of allegiance by the high elves. They feel threatened. It's an existential threat. And so what this does is that it actually motivates those who would otherwise be questioning the current moment, the regime, into supporting it once again. And so what he basically says is, well, Roe v. Wade is an example of this. It's actually stimulating support for the regime from the class that the Dark Elves want to shift over to our side. Thus, hobbits, you should not be engaging in the culture war. Leave it to the Dark Elves. Support us. Give us the space to do it. We will shift the culture by discrediting the political formula of the current order. Thus, we will draw many elites or Dark Elves to our side, and then together, the Hobbit mob and the Dark Elf elite can take over from this and establish a new society, one which is better for elves and for hobbits. That's the thrust, as I understand it. And I'd be interested to hear if anybody has any different takes on what he's essentially arguing. But now I want to get into the meat and bones of it. One of the reasons why people were so upset, of course, is that he was on a day of jubilation saying it was a day that we should be mourning the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But I think actually the primary reason why people were upset by this article is the nature of the analogy that he's using. And I want to draw on something called affect theory here. So in the philosophy and history of emotions, there are various theories about the nature of our feelings. And one of these is affect theory. Whereas emotions are often understood as responses they're responses to stimuli that our minds have evaluated first. So, um, and it could almost be like you see something and you judge it to be good for you, or something nice. Um, and as a consequence, this arouses in me happiness, something like that. Or um, I evaluate that you are a threat to me, and so I feel fear. Right? This could be a very instinctive judgment, but nonetheless, it has a cognitive aspect, which then arouses a felt form of that judgment. Affects, so the theory goes, are non-discursive, so they do not rely on the evaluation of the mind. Rather, they are almost instinctive impulses in response to non-rational things or non-rational aspects of our experience. For example, right? So in the corner here, you will see that I have a little bubble saying Nathan C.J. Hood, and it has got behind it the color red. Now, you probably didn't even think about it or notice it, but that will be part of your experience, part of your field of consciousness. And this color will be having some kind of impact upon your emotions, maybe even slightly, your temperament. If we change it, for example, to, let's see, uh, orange. Now, this orange is often known to evoke feelings of fight or flight. It's an aggressive color. Whereas if we move it over to something like duck egg blue, this is known as a very calming color. These are things which you didn't think about, your mind didn't evaluate it, but there's a certain instinctual response to the color. And this is true of things like the tone of my voice, or the light coming in through the window over there. For politicians, it's things like the way that they have their hair or the color of their suit, whether it's tidy or messy, whether a politician wears a tie or not. All these things we observe and we feel something in response to. We have an interpretation below the level of our discursive thought. With that in mind, then, I think that this analogy fundamentally angered people fundamentally because there's certain connotations to the archetypes, Tolkien's archetypes, which Yarvin's theories run diametrically against, or seemingly do so. And as a consequence, it makes people very there's a certain tension when you read it. It feels wrong what he's saying, especially using these categories. So let me get into it. Well, the first thing to say is that Yarvin makes this point in the second article that all of these categories, as he's using them, are roles. They're not races. He's very explicit about that. And throughout, he wants to make sure that these are social positions rather than references to specific ethnic groups. And although these roles are hereditary, they can also be adopted. You can change from one role to another. The easiest example of this is the elves. Elves can be, in his view, dwarves, orcs, hobbits, even zombies perhaps, can become elves through university education. So this isn't something which is like a transformation from species to species. And I think actually what a better way to put it, because I don't think roles is helpful here, is culture. You can transition from having a hobbit mentality or attitude to that of an elf. That is one of modernity. And this makes sense given that universities have become centers whereby students are trained to think according to the ideology of today. They're taught, for example, critical theory, or more recently, they may be taught feminist approaches, critical race theory, etc., etc. So they're taught to think, or to reduce meta narratives to relations of power, essentially. So they are deeply modern. But he also wants to have it. There's, I think, culture helps too, because he wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to say these are just roles, right? So the elves typically are the elites in the society, whereas hobbits are not. But at the same time, he wants to geographically locate these different groups. So quite broadly as well. So hobbits are red state, while elves are blue state. And this as a consequence identifies it with peoples. We might say tribes, the Democrat tribe and the Republican tribe. I think he's also underplaying that the ethnic aspect of group formation, insofar as we looked at last time, the Normans and the Saxons. There tends to be in virtually every society certain ethnic groups which rise to the top, and certain ones which are underneath. But that's by the by. He wants to make it about social role. But of course, right, the problem with that is the analogy he's using, the archetypes he's using, refer to specific species. A dwarf in Middle-earth cannot become an elf. A hobbit cannot become an orc. It's not possible. There's actually there's an interesting relationship between elf and orc here, but I'm not going to get into that just at the moment. He wants to say you can transition from one role to another, but the categories he's using defy transitioning in that way. So that's not a helpful starting point. It actually jars automatically. And I think, as a consequence, culture is a better way of putting it, because we do find in The Lord of the Rings an interesting phenomenon, which is that certain hobbits, like Frodo and Bilbo, are a little bit strange compared to most hobbits. Let me row back a second. The virtue, or the reason why Yarvin wants to use these categories at all, then, is because they're what C.S. Lewis called visible souls. It's a literary device by which you can reveal a lot about a character according to their appearance. So, for example, Aslan is a lion, and a lion is majestic, it's bold, it's brave, it's dangerous. These are all things that we know instinctively about Aslan just because of the kind of creature he is. Fantasy writers often use this technique because when they're dealing with loads of characters, it's very helpful to convey a lot of information about a character's personality through their body very quickly to an audience. So you can you don't need to define it all for them. And that's the benefit of this approach, right? Because instinctively, he's got a point about many people on the right, insofar as they don't want to rule, they want to be left alone. And that is certainly true of the hobbits of The Lord of the Rings. Their community, they want to be isolated from the outside world. They don't want to be mixing with other people. They find other people scary and strange. They have no ambitions to conquer anybody else. They just want to be left alone to live their lives. And if anybody does anything out of the ordinary, they're regarded with suspicion. Somebody like Gandalf, is considered a disturber of the peace for getting Bilbo involved with the quest to the Lonely Mountain. Indeed, even the fact that the hobbits across the water like going in boats, that's considered strange for the hobbits of Hobbiton. So we have this dynamic, whereas the elves, in Yarvin's view, they are mighty and wise creatures, very beautiful, who love beauty and seek beauty, and they're concerned with the high things of the world. Um, Characters like Elrond and Galadriel want to are in discussions about what we should do about the necromancer in Mirkwood. They're trying to organize resistance to Sauron. You can see the archetypal parallels here. There is a certain visible soul in place. But as I've said, the species aspect makes it very difficult to reflect the fact that he wants these to be roles. But seeing it as culture might be more helpful, because we do find some of the stranger hobbits, such as Frodo and Bilbo, actually having a great love for Elvish culture, learning Elvish poems, learning its languages, writing its history. Indeed, at the end of the Return of the King, they do not go and live with the rest of the hobbits. They head off with the last elves across the sea to the Undying Lands. So we do have examples here of hobbits not becoming elves, but taking on the elvish culture in some way. And this might even reflect the fact that in The Lord of the Rings itself, we see the hobbits develop their own elite. At the beginning of the story, okay, there's a thane who oversees the postmen and the bounders, those who protect the borders from kind of wild wolves and things. But there really isn't a government in the Shire. This leaves it open to evil forces, and when the hobbits return, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, from their adventures, they find that it's been taken over by Sharky, aka Saruman, and his ruffians, who are dominating the place. And some scholars have suggested this is because the hobbits were not a political body. They had no concept of the enemy as such prior to the War of the Ring. They were more concerned about, their petty squabbles than their own existential existence. And so they were susceptible to darker forces manipulating the situation and very easily walking in and taking over. Through their adventures, through their exposure to other cultures and daring, very dangerous situations that they had to act in, the hobbits return and become the new elite, and they're able to overthrow the ruffians quite easily. They mobilize the hobbits, they rouse them up to resistance, and very quickly they are defeated. So we already have some issue with this analogy, in that you can't move between species within the Lord of the Rings, but there are some hobbits who also have elite aspects to them. I find it very difficult to not see, by the end of the story, Merry and Pippin, for example, as in Yarvin's words, elves. Right? They've been through the world. They know what's outside the Shire's borders, and they've fought with evil. They're not like most hobbits anymore. So there's a problem with the analogy there. We can't really express that. But I think there's an even deeper issue with the analogy, which is that fundamentally it goes against the spirit of the Lord of the Rings, what Yarvin's trying to say here. If I'm right, and he's saying actually we shouldn't be resisting as hobbits, but actually just hand it over to the dark elves to undermine the credibility of the current regime. Well, this seems to go against the very features of the plot. The plot focuses on a hobbit who takes the ring to Mordor to destroy it. It's an ordinary person. It's somebody who doesn't want to rule, who doesn't desire power, who isn't interested in dominating other people. He's the opposite of an elite. He's not powerful and he doesn't desire power. He is the hero of the story, and it's his goal to actually overthrow the instrument of absolute power, or the instrument by which Sauron can have absolute power. The for and this is really important, because actually the characters who would be equivalent to the elites in this world, like Galadriel and Gandalf, reject the ring precisely because they know what they could do with this power. Whereas, so they are unsuitable for this task. Whereas Frodo is suited to it because of his lack of power. It's this kind of this idea that St. Paul talks about, that God will use the weak things of the world to shame the wise. And there's a sense in which Tolkien's built this into his narrative. And let's turn to Gandalf for a second, because what for somebody like Yarvin, Gandalf should rule the hobbits, right? Gandalf is wise, he's good, he's powerful, and he certainly has the means and capability to rule the hobbits. He would be able to create a flourishing society, a very competently run society for the hobbits, and he would try to respect the hobbits' customs and wishes. And this is what Saruman wants to do, right? Saruman, who in the beginning wants to fight Sauron for the preservation of good, invites Gandalf to join with him to overthrow Sauron, so that they can use their knowledge to bring order to the world. Gandalf rejects this because he doesn't see his role as this. He sees himself as a steward, seeking to preserve anything which is good in the world. And as part of that, try to support all the free peoples of the world in resisting Sauron, whether they be hobbits, elves, dwarves, and men. And he encourages them all to fight in their own little way. It's not the task of everybody to lead the defense of Helm's Deep, but they can contribute in a different way. Such as, for example, Merry and Pippin being in, Pippin ends up in a situation where he saves Faramir, and Merry is involved in saving Éowyn. They're small acts, but they're significant. The very character of Gandalf argues against Yarvin's point that you should do nothing and just let the elites deal with it. He actually believes that any action can be, which is resisting evil, which is fighting for good, is worthwhile and can contribute to the final victory. I think then, and I just to kind of bring this back round, because Balkan War Criminal, hello sir, you've made a very good point where you say, are we sure Yarvin cares about the mythological and theological views of Tolkien? He definitely doesn't. And that's not, or if he does, he's not trying to do that in these articles, right? He's using it as a vehicle to explain his elite theory. But why I'm going into this is because I think there was such a negative reaction. There was quite an angry backlash against what he said. And I think part of it is to do with the fact that the archetypes he's using are diametrically opposed, or seem diametrically opposed to the ideas he's promoting. And that's why I'm saying, with Frodo or Gandalf, these characters don't make sense in Yarvin's worldview. Yet he's using these kinds of characters to mediate his ideas. So there's a conflict there between form and substance, and as a consequence, it didn't sit right with many people. It felt like he was, in a sense, desecrating Tolkien for his own end. We might want to be a bit more charitable though with this, and I think there's at least two ways we could redraw, or some instances we can use in the story to maybe represent more clearly his idea. So, for example, he tries to make the elves the rulers, and this to me again is a bad idea, because the elves, although they do love beauty, and he wants to say that people in blue states love beauty, which I find a kind of baffling comment. The elves in the Lord of the Rings, by that point, they're not interested in ruling Middle Earth. They are quite content to preserve their own places. Rivendell, Lothlorien, and Mirkwood are somewhat isolationist. They don't want intruders, and they don't want to be exporting their culture to anybody else. They just want to maintain what they have for as long as possible while the world around them decays. These are not the same people as the current rulers of the West, right? Far more similar is Sauron. And Sauron, who wants to elevate himself to rule all Middle Earth, who wants to dominate all life, he is much more similar to the current regime. If that's the case, then maybe a better kind of comparison here would be between the angelic beings, such as Sauron, who's a fallen Maiar or angel, and Saruman and Gandalf, because these are the elite faction, we might say, in Middle Earth. They have all of these people have the power to rule, right? And what we find is, if we put it like that, well, Sauron could be how would we put it? Of the spiritual beings, he is the regime at the moment. He stands for that. He's the archetype of that. Saruman is actually Yarvin's position, because he argues that within that class of like the ruling class, what you need is for a part of it to overturn the current regime, that we need to build up a new elite. That's Saruman's plan, essentially. Although he is willing to go along with Sauron for a time, in the end he hopes to overturn him and replace him. And in fact, he encourages Gandalf not to resist. Right? He's not just as Yarvin says that the hobbits shouldn't fight the high elves because it stops the dark elves from overthrowing them. So Saruman encourages Gandalf to join with him, because together they can overthrow Sauron. He shouldn't resist Sauron openly. He should do so by letting Saruman ascend, essentially. So that's a much more within the world. That's a better comparison, although it's not as face on. Additionally, we might want to see as well that the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings, they're allowed to live this comfortable isolationist life because of people acting on their behalf outside of their knowledge, namely the Rangers of the North, led by Aragorn. We're told that the borders of the Shire are kept defended by the Rangers in the wild, without the Hobbit's knowledge. And this suggests to me that uh, there's already a elite might be the wrong word, but that those the hobbits who are unable to rule themselves or to kind of act in their own defense, others take it upon themselves to preserve their way of life. And when Aragorn becomes king, he makes it a law that no man shall enter the Shire from henceforth. So we have this self-governing people who are sustained by powers, by elite powers, essentially, who protect them and maintain the possibility of their culture. And to his credit, that is essentially what Yarvin, in his second article, argues, that if the Dark Elves can take over, they need to be of such a sort that they will preserve the hobbits and rule the hobbits, not in an effort to make them into elves, but that they can live as hobbits. So there's a symmetry there, and I think we can take some sympathy there. This leads to the broader point, I think, which is that the analogy obscures too much. It really doesn't help to explain what he's fundamentally trying to say. In part because of the things I've mentioned about the plot of the Lord of the Rings, and these ideas about all people being able to contribute to the final victory, that the smallest person, as it were, can be the instrument of overthrowing the dark power, and so on. They rely on a providential view of history, that there are powers beyond the material which, through the free actions of creatures, influence the course of history. Gandalf mentions this concerning the finding of the ring, that Bilbo and Frodo were meant to find the ring, or to have the ring, not by the ring itself, nor by Sauron, but by some other power, a force working for good. This seems to work throughout the Lord of the Rings, bringing through seeming coincidences fantastic results, or unexpected results, which, if it wasn't for the influence of this power, the heroes probably would have lost many times over. In other words, there's a belief in a higher supernatural reality which is shaping the ideas of the Lord of the Rings, and this is no surprise given Tolkien himself was a Roman Catholic, and he was drawing for his material upon Christian and pagan mythology, where these ideas are brimming. You cannot read something like Beowulf or Norse mythology without seeing the presence of the supernatural soaked in the world. This is totally missing from Yarvin. He's an avowed atheist, and he said things in the past like religious belief has no bearing upon one's actions. So this is a man who's excluded that aspect from his analysis. As a consequence, and I think he sees this as part of the modern condition, that as we reduce everything to power or to psychological health or imbalance, etc., etc. It's all relative to where you grew up in history, man. It's not genuine. We can explain it through your upbringing and so on. Well, then, of course, his worldview is going to clash with the analogy he's using. Game of Thrones would probably be a better source because its author shares the same cynical view of the world in many ways. That would have been a much better source material. But nonetheless, I do think there are some interesting ideas here behind the form, behind the analogy. There's something interesting which Yarvin is saying, which I think many of us would agree with, which is that not everybody is cut out for ruling. Actually, only a very small minority are cut out for ruling. Moreover, and so populism, this idea that the people can overthrow the current regime and take over and run it according to a sort of will enable every people to live freely and happily without interference from others. That's not going to happen. There's always an oligarchy that rules of some kind or another, and it will impose a moral framework and order upon its society to lesser or greater extents. And this is why he says, it's a bad idea of the current regime to try and make everybody into an elf, into somebody who can take part within the regime, because not everybody's cut out for it, and it actually causes friction as a consequence. In this, I think he's very similar to Julian Huxley in his outlook, because I'll come to that in a second. I'm getting ahead of myself. What he also makes the salient point that the way that a regime change is going to happen, you cannot just have a mob turn up and overthrow the current regime, because it will meet with too much resistance at the current moment. It's almost unassailable. What's actually required is cultural shifts, not just amongst dissidents, but actually you need to undermine the allegiance of a large part of the ruling class, because they will form the new counter elite who, with the support of the mob, can take over. The mob can overthrow, but it leaves a vacuum. Someone has to take its place. And indeed, if the mob's actions are going to have credence, are going to be accepted by the populace, then you will need to also change the culture. This gets into ideas put forward by Mosca and Hofer, which are that every regime has what you might call a political formula. This is the moral and legal basis by which the regime justifies its sovereignty. We might say that every regime appeals to a certain set of moral principles or absolute values, which it claims that its being in place becomes an instrument for achieving those things. For example, the current regime heavily emphasizes that we need it because through it we will receive healthcare and protection. Ultimately, we will survive through this. Or alternatively, this regime enables us to be happy. And so we get slogans like, you will own nothing and be happy, or you will be happy and own nothing. I can't remember the order. But it's this idea that there's a value that many people hold to be the highest goal in life, or one of the highest goals, happiness or their health. And the governing class at the current moment should be in place because through them we can achieve these goals. Whether they do or not is a question of their competency and effectiveness. But their fundamental moral basis relies on these absolute goals. Now, it's really important for a regime to convince a populace of this political formula, because if it is discredited, then not only will the people no longer consent to the rule of the governing class, but certain counter elites will also emerge, and it won't be very long before there is an overturning of the regime. So it needs to manufacture consent. It needs for the absolute values that it bases itself on to correspond with the highest goals or assumptions of ordinary people and elites as to what's important in life. Yarvin's argument, as I take it, is that the Dark Elves are those who can challenge the political formula of the current regime. They have the intellectual and artistic capability to discredit it. In so doing, they can undermine the regime's legitimacy and thereby create the conditions for revolution. This idea is not particularly new. Herfer, in his wonderful book, let me see if I can find its exact title here. I think it's called The True Believer, the Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements. Yes, he argues that for mass movements to have effect, first, the men of words need to come into play. They need to challenge the creeds and doctrines of the ruling elite, discrediting them, making them a laughingstock, making it so that it's hard to believe in them anymore. This provides the people with an ability to reject the regime and seek for something new, and pave the way for a new counter elite to direct that mass movement. So I think he's arguing this point, and he sees kind of populism as getting in the way of this, because it's directing the conflict between left and right. Whereas actually what needs to take place, I'm not sure he would put it in this way, but I'm going to put it as charitably as I can. We need to challenge the fundamental assumptions that the regime rests itself upon. It's no good just saying, well, the tax rate isn't high enough, low enough or high enough, or we need to give more powers to the states. It's no good just saying, oh, we need to have more opportunities for students to learn at home, for homeschooling. These are all good things, but they rest upon assumptions about what the good life is. And currently, our regime has a dominance over what the culture believes the good life is, what most people believe it is. The very fact that for months on end, the peoples of the West, and indeed other countries, were very willing to be in lockdown suggests to me that the majority of the population are convinced and persuaded that their health is one of the highest goals in life, one of the highest priorities. And if the government can deliver that by any means, then it's justified, including lockdowns, right? We're willing to give up all our freedoms as long as you keep us alive. That's the idea. And we're going to see this justifying so many things. We've seen it justify banning smoking in public buildings in the UK. We're going to see it justify taxes on sugar, taxes on salt, taxes on anything deemed unhealthy. It's used by people like Yuval Harari, Elon Musk, and the Futures for Britain advocates funded by the Tony Blair Institute to justify technological advances. Because although there's all these other sides to technology, primarily we should have more technology because it will help us to prevent disease. The basis, the fundamental value which is assumed is that anything which helps us to be healthier is good. So we should do it. So the regime is justified because it promotes those things which will make us healthy or helps us to secure our health. I went on a bit of a tangent there. But I think, and I hope that's kind of where Yarvin is, or at least that's Yarvin is suggesting that we need to discredit, and through that, especially many of the elites, by doing so, we will be able to remove the legitimacy of the regime. So if people no longer believed that their health came above all other things, or the health of their family came above all other things, it would be much harder for the regime to justify itself, because most of what it does is based on that principle. Do you see? It's they wouldn't have the consent of the elites or the populace to lock us down, or to ban sugary foods, or to impose invasive technologies upon us, which will monitor us 24/7 in the name of our health, because we will value other things more highly. That is a possible strength of what he is trying to do. However, I think for Yarvin, he actually shares many of the values of our regime, just as so-called counter-elites like Elon Musk seem to do too. They're not part of the current system fully, although obviously there's certain integration. What they complain about is the efficiency and effectiveness of our regime in implementing policies and actions in order to achieve these goals. So for example, Musk justifies the development of the neural chip on the basis that it will help people with limbs that don't function properly. Now, of course, right? This then justifies a chip which he then believes could be used for so many other things, like talking with other people, sharing files, sharing thoughts, allowing for monitoring of people, and so on. He smuggles all these things in because he believes the neural chip will help with people's health, or at least he could justify it on that basis. So he's fundamentally aligned with one of the principal values of our current regime. He just sees the current regime as very ineffective in delivering its methods, delivering these ends. Yarvin is also the same. And I think we see this particularly in the second article, where he complains about the competency of the current regime trying to make every hobbit into an elf, And then also this idea that he has that actually it doesn't matter who rules us as long as they're good rulers. He has this strange phrase that comes in. I'm just trying to find it. Let's see. You probably already know the one I'm talking about. He writes, "Suppose you were well ruled by alien octopus robots. Would you have an issue? Why? As Alexander Pope wrote, for forms of government let fools contest. Whatever governs best is best." The very idea that it doesn't really matter who or what governs as long as they're practically good strikes me as more of the same, because it assumes that there is not a natural order of who should rule and who should not, in a sense, but beyond just hierarchies of competence or merit. He sees it as just prejudice, essentially, to believe that it's wrong that alien octopus robots shouldn't rule us. One might wonder if his own context may be contributing to this sort of idea, right? But I guess, yeah, it's essentially we can, as long as you've got an effective ruler, it doesn't matter who they are, where they come from, what their values are, in any meaningful sense, as long as they can do the job better than the current regime. And he even frames it in terms of competency. So students of political science place too much attention on quality of government. An incompetent regime may deliver low quality service, but beneath some threshold of competence, the regime loses the ability to hold power. A few paragraphs down, the middle American hobbit has suffered such structural depredations from the seaboard elf that we can easily demonstrate his incompetence to rule. Proof that the hobbits are not competent to rule. They let the elves rule them. Further up, so he's more concerned about the administrative effectiveness of a regime, that its policies make it a well-run society, than he is in terms of challenging many of the base assumptions. Of course, he would disagree with something like equality of outcome and indeed equality of opportunity. But this is because he believes these things get in the way of the administration of a good society. Its competence. It's not really about the fundamental values that a society's regime is based upon. I mean, I've not read enough Yarvin to say conclusively these things. Somebody out there probably will come up with some great quotes which disprove everything I'm saying. I just wouldn't be surprised if a Yarvin style regime would be technocratic in terms of its outlook, would seek to use more efficient means to deliver the same goals of health and happiness, especially as he himself is an avowed atheist, who sees no place for religion. He would be quite happy to allow the hobbits to live their own lives as hobbits, but the state would be delivering on health and happiness. That would be, and its competency would be measured in terms of how effective it is at delivering these things. So, so I was going to mention Huxley here because I think actually there's a strong similarity with Julian Huxley's ideas. Huxley, for those of you who don't know, was the first president of UNESCO, and he was also one of the originators of transhumanism. And there's this very interesting passage within Huxley's opening address to UNESCO, and I just wanted to read a little bit of it because it struck me as somewhat similar to Yarvin's outlook on life. So in some ways there's some truths in there, but also there's some dark things. Ultimately, I should lay the context out. So ultimately, for Huxley, he wants UNESCO to work towards a world where we can develop through scientific methods and education a peaceful world in which there will be the elevation of humanity to its highest form. He's already argued that to do this, we need to create an integration of all human cultures and traditions under one political body. That although we will maintain the distinctions of human cultures, we need to have we essentially need to have peace, and this can only be achieved by political unity. Additionally, we should also level up educational, scientific, and cultural facilities in all areas of the world, including, in his words, backward sectors and underprivileged sections of a population. So he then moves on to a discussion of equality. So here we go. We come to a difficult problem, that of discovering how we can reconcile our principle of human equality with the biological fact of human inequality. Perhaps the problem is not so difficult as it appears when stated in this paradoxical form, but the contradiction largely disappears as soon as it is realized that equality is used in two very different senses. The democratic principle of equality, which is also UNESCO's, is a principle of equality of opportunity, that human beings should be equal before the law, should have equal opportunities for education, for making a living, for freedom of expression, and movement and thought. The biological absence of equality, on the other hand, concerns the natural endowments of man and the fact of genetic difference in regard to them. There are instances of biological inequality which are so gross that they cannot be reconciled at all with the principle of equal opportunity. Thus, low-grade mental defectives cannot be offered equality of educational opportunity, nor are the insane equal with the sane before the law in the respect of most freedoms. However, the full implications of the fact of human equality have not often been drawn and certainly need to be brought out here, as they are very relevant to UNESCO's task. Concretely, genetic human equality is of two types. First, there is inequality of mere difference. Some people are fair and others are dark. Some are tall and thin, others short and stocky. Some have a natural gift for music, others for athletics. Some are introspective, others practical and extrovert. Indeed, we can now definitely state that no two human beings, with the single exception of the members of pairs of identical twins, are biologically equal in the sense of possessing the same genetic constitution. This is largely due to one of man's biological peculiarities, namely that his local differentiation into races has not continued to the stage of separate and intersterile species, as in almost all other organisms, but has always been followed by migration and interbreeding. But whatever its cause, the resultant high degree of variability is a fact, and one of considerable evolutionary importance. Secondly, there is a difference in quality or level. Human beings are not equal in respect of various desirable qualities. Some are strong, others weak. Some healthy, others chronic invalids. Some long-lived, others short-lived. Some bright, others dull. Some of high, others of low intelligence. Some mathematically gifted, others very much the reverse. Some kind and good, others cruel and selfish. It is usually not so easy to say how much of this second sort of inequality is due to hereditary and therefore relevant for our purpose, how much only to the effects of physical or social environment. But in most cases, we now know, and in almost all can be reasonably sure, that some at least of the difference is genetic. This is certain, for instance, of length of life, physical strength, and most important for our purpose, for intellectual gifts, both special ones like mathematical aptitude and general ones like intelligence. It is therefore of the greatest importance to preserve human variety. All attempts at reducing it, whether by attempting to obtain greater purity and therefore uniformity within a so-called race or national group, or by attempting to exterminate any of the broad racial groups which give our species its major variety, are scientifically incorrect and opposed to long-run human progress. On the contrary, UNESCO should aim at securing the fullest contribution to the common pool from racial groups which, owing to their remoteness or their backwardness, have so far had little share in it. The fact of human difference has another implication for UNESCO. Every encouragement should be given to the study of distinct psychophysical types. I'll just skip forward a little bit more. There remains the second type of inequality. This has quite other implications, for whereas variety is in itself desirable, the existence of weaklings, fools, and moral deficients cannot but be bad. It is also much harder to reconcile politically with the current democratic doctrine of equality. In face of it, indeed, the principle of equality of opportunity must be amended to read equality of opportunity within the limits of aptitude. Thus, it is a fact, however disagreeable, that a considerable percentage of the population is not capable of profiting from higher education. To this point we shall return later. It is equally a fact that a considerable percentage of young men have to be rejected for military service on the grounds of physical weakness or mental instability, and that these grounds are often genetic in origin. Again, many people are not intelligent or not scrupulous enough to be entrusted with political responsibility, a fact which unfortunately does not prevent quite a number of them from attaining it. To adjust the principle of democratic equality to the fact of biological inequality is a major task for the world, one which will grow increasingly more urgent as we make progress towards realizing equality of opportunity. This does not mean, of course, that UNESCO should aim at labeling, docketing, or dragooning humanity. It means that it should encourage all studies and all methods which can be used to ensure that men find the right jobs and are kept away from the wrong jobs, to ensure that individuals find outlets satisfying to their temperament and work appropriate to their talents, while at the same time ensuring that society is not overburdened with people in positions for which they are inadequate or, still worse, which they are likely to abuse. Biological inequality is, of course, the bedrock fact of all of eugenics is predicated, but it is not usually realized that the two types of inequality have quite different and indeed contrary eugenic implications. The equality of mere difference is desirable, and the preservation of human variety should be one of the two primary aims of eugenics. But the inequality of level or standard is undesirable, and the other primary aim of eugenics should be the raising of the mean level of all desirable qualities. At the moment, it is probable that the indirect effect of civilization is dysgenic instead of eugenic, and in any case, it seems likely that the dead weight of genetic stupidity, physical weakness, mental instability, and disease proneness, which already exist in the human species, will prove too great a burden for real progress to be achieved. Thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care, and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, so that much that now is unthinkable may at least become thinkable. So it's I think what we see in Huxley is an idea that we need um, to build society fundamentally based on merit. That we should provide those who have been, through genetics, afforded various desirable qualities like intelligence and strength, temperament, and so on, opportunities to advance and take up positions of power, of leadership, of authority, whether that be politically or in education, the sciences, etc., the arts. Those who do not have these aptitudes should not be part of the ruling class or elite. And the problem at the moment for Huxley, and he's writing this many years ago, is that democracy, with its emphasis upon equality of outcome, equality of opportunity for all people, stifles merit. It actually creates a dysgenic society, as opposed to um, a eugenic society. And again, let's be clear, he's not arguing that we should exterminate kind of dysgenic groups. He very bluntly says we shouldn't do that. But he is arguing that we need to structure the hierarchy of society according to merit. A corollary of this is that, in his view, we need to have diversity, because there's a possibility that there will be any any group can produce somebody who has merit. So if we need to have a diverse diverse peoples working together, because through them we will be able to get the best of every group into the regime. This to me seems very similar to Yarvin's idea here, right? Because he argues that we need a meritocratic society, one that is run by people who deserve to be in that place, who have the abilities to be in that place, not by people who are incapable of ruling. The problem with the current system, in part, is it wants to make people who are incapable of ruling rulers. So we need to do away with that idea. Instead, we should only afford opportunities that, of higher education, for example, to those of the elven class, or those from the other classes who show aptitude. And they can then become part of the ruling elite. This can only take place if we can change the. Well, for Huxley, it's going to require a massive propaganda exercise in which the public is convinced that eugenics is a good idea. Yarvin also wants the Dark Elves to be given free rein to overturn the current orthodoxies to allow for this somewhat meritocratic regime to rule. And this is why it's, in his view, acceptable for alien octopus robots to rule us. Because if they're the best at doing it, then why shouldn't they be allowed to do it? Why wouldn't we want them? They would be the best rulers. The problem with his argument, fundamentally, is it's based on a conception of society which is it's flawed from the beginning, because actually peoples should not just be a composite of what the scientists define as the best society. Actually, we have a history, we have a culture and shared traditions. We have ancestors who helped to build and build our institutions and shape the land in which we are nourished and belong. And we are the stewards of what they have passed on to us, stewards to pass it on to others. This is not just for anybody to rule. we have a heritage which shapes the way in which our land ought to be ruled, our people ought to be ruled. And that's true of each distinct group. It is not for some utilitarian purpose that we should hand it over to some alien force, as he describes it. That's wrong. That's wrong on a fundamental basis. It's a dereliction of our duty. And moreover, our customs, our traditions, which have no necessarily rational explanation, but still make us who we are, they'll be scrapped away. They'll be done away with in the name of progress, in the name of efficiency, in the name of merit. But no, merit is not the highest goal. And certainly the aims of health and happiness are not the highest goals. There is something more. There is something more. There is a commitment to us, to our people, to our God, and so on. I think at root, his whole thinking on this point is so antithetical to the form he uses. Sauron, I'm sure, was probably the smartest and most clever individual in Middle-earth. He probably had, and according to Yarvin, he should have been allowed to rule all of Middle-earth. He had the merit to do so. He is the alien octopus robot. But Tolkien's world is built with natural order. When somebody usurps the natural order, when they try to take sovereignty away from those who it's rightfully theirs, it decimates themselves and the world. Mordor is a barren, desolate wasteland. This is symptomatic of the fact that Sauron does not have the right to rule there. It is not his land. He's taken it and disrupted the proper order of reality. Similarly, while both Rohan and Gondor suffer while their monarchs, well, in the case of Theoden, is incapacitated by Grima Wormtongue's lies. In the case of Gondor, the king has not returned yet. It's under the steward has fallen away. The natural order needs to be restored. And natural order is tied in with the transcendent, but also with the unique identity and history and heritage and culture and ethnos of the peoples who live in those places. It's just a world apart. It's just a world apart. So that is just some thoughts on Yarvin's articles. I appreciate that went in a lot of different directions there, and we covered a lot of different points. But I think there's some really interesting ideas. I do think his points about the nature of the ruling class and how we bring about revolution is worth consideration. But I've been trying to emphasize that by using the Lord of the Rings as a vehicle for his political formula, he actually not only is there a deep tension between the two, but it actually shows the rather progressive aspects of Yarvin's thought, insofar as he's willing to do away with tradition, well, really anything which gets in the way of merit or a more effective government, which I don't think is a particularly conservative point of view or reactionary point of view. It's a what he would call modern, I would call liberal perspective. It's utilitarian at heart. The greatest good for the greatest number of people, brought about by the most meritocratic regime. So anyway, let me have a look at the chat. As usual, if you've got any comments, feel free to put them in. Any questions, put them in. I appreciate that we will be potentially running into unpopular opinions, but that always runs late, so we'll be getting out of here pretty soon. So let's see, Vingle. Vingle is a wonderful commenter. He's always so faithful, and he's got a good wit on him. It's a good wit. I hope that I have managed to keep you from despair, my friend, in this regard, and that you enjoyed the Tolkien and Yarvin content. Good evening, James. It's great to see you, as always. Hello, pal. Hello, friend. Looking forward to C.S. Lewis Week. Yes, Shiatori. It's probably going to be in December. That's the initial plan, so there's quite a bit of time yet. And essentially, once September's passed, we might get some more developments then on it. Let's see. I'm going to skip some of these more suspect comments, my friends, to save my channel. Okay. Seriously, Yarvin is no more our friend than all the Pelosi's and the Kamalas in Washington. You know, I think he is more of a friend in the sense that he wants a society which is good for all people. Now, as I have kind of illustrated, I think his assumptions about how to achieve that are inherently progressive. And so we would disagree with him on a lot of things. I don't think that he's somebody who's interested in preserving kind of a common heritage or a adhering. He just wouldn't see an attitude of being informed by one's ancestors as being seeking to maintain and allow to flourish one's cultural traditions and roots as important. In part, I think that's because what he means by modern is kind of this alienated, dislocated, deracinated individual who sees all cultural peculiarities as relative to just where you were born, with no significance beyond that. There's no higher meaning to these things that we need to pass on. We just need a more effective regime. But he doesn't, to my mind, he doesn't hate us. he wants us on his side, which is more than can be said for Pelosi and Kamala, right? So when it comes to the friend-enemy distinction, he wants us all to be his friend against Pelosi and Kamala so that he can rule. I mean, the suggestion that I think this is an interesting point as well. He sees himself as part of the elite class and his readers as not. I find this strange because there's many people within this sphere who are of equal intellectual ability, who have a greater aesthetic and spiritual and moral compass, but he sees himself as superior. Maybe this is a particularly American kind of attitude. I don't know, but it's I find it very strange given the circles that he appeals to. It's a strange one. Anad, hello, no name. Good to see you, sir. Yeah, I see what you mean about like there's a elite faction and that needs to be overturned, and that there is another elite faction within Numenor which is resisting. I think why he doesn't go for something like that is because he wants something instantly recognizable to an audience. So hobbits and elves, most people will have heard of that. The Fall of Numenor, alas, is not well known to a popular audience. So he would need to do too much work to explain the archetypes. But I definitely agree that that would be a stronger uh, anal- analogy, much more relevant. And actually, the Fall of Numenor is, yeah, we need to do a stream on it sometime. Speaking of which, I know that Apostolic Majesty is bringing back the Ainun and Dale, the Ardania streams sometime soon. So we may get to it there. Hello, Balkan war criminal. I hope you're not one. Yarvin tries to bet on Teal and the rest of the coastal city protectionist anti-China Republicans, maintaining that Sokon townies and their representatives are no chance. He's too confident. He is way too confident on that. Way too bigging up their potential to be the counter elite. In part because, and I really think this is key, they mainly share the same values as to what's important in the world. You know, we need a healthier population, a happier population, a greener population. They just disagree on how to bring that about, by and large. I'm not convinced that they're really that interested in real conservative values. Perhaps. Good old Shire Tory playing devil's advocate. I understand Yarvin's point. Conservative folk won't have what it takes to destroy the current regime. Most people won't. That's why I believe in the great man of history. Ah, yes. Well, you see, I think he's right in the current moment, but I believe what he's trying to argue is that by allowing the Dark Elves to take over the trends of culture, they will be able to discredit the regime's political formula. Thereby, most people will no longer consent to the regime's rule. They will be mobilized to a place where they will actually rebel. Is this true? I think there's some truth to it. It's not the whole story, but take a great man. Carlyle defines the great man as somebody who's possessed by an idea, who's absolutely sincere in their devotion to this higher ideal. So for Cromwell, it is for a godly society. He's absolutely devoted to it. He will do everything to bring this about. But where does that idea come from? It comes from his religion. His religion is a set of beliefs and practices which inculcate a vision of life, which many people had at that time, but Cromwell was, along with some others, very devoted to. And it's his absolute tenacity in furthering this ideal which enables him to become, in Carlyle's view, the great man. So I do believe the role of the kind of intellectual elite class is really important in laying the groundwork for somebody like a Cromwell to emerge. And actually, in Carlyle's book, Heroes and Hero Worship, we have some examples, right? So we have Luther and John Knox. Certainly, Cromwell's ideas have a descent. They're descended from Luther's ideological revolution, and to a lesser extent, Cromwell and Cromwell's ideas are informed by John Knox, and Carlyle also mentions the Puritans. The Puritans being the primary influence, right? So the matrix of cultural beliefs and the way that they undermine the authority of Charles I, the political formula of absolute sovereignty over the church and the nation, because he's threatening true religion. This provides the bedrock for Cromwell's heroics. So I think we can marry what Yarvin's saying here to the great man of history view. I think it's actually a precondition for it. Let's see. Bjarki, good to see you, sir. I remember in the 90s, Vikernes used to say the elves were the Kaikis as the chosen people of Valinor. Sorry, I have no idea what you've just said there, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, sir. Please forgive me. You could see it that way, yes. You could see that as a quality of the elves, that they seem to have an inherent wisdom. This is one of the problems with the analogy, because he's not only trying to apply it to the elite classes of like intellectuals and artisans, right? He also wants to say that this characterizes blue America. Is that really true? Are democratic states filled with inherently wise people? People who love beauty and pursue the truth and are guarded in what they say? This doesn't strike me as New York or Los Angeles. There may be individuals within these communities, right, who have these, but to try and divide up according to political tribal lines, and give the character of elf to the Democrat line, or the those who belong in those areas, it doesn't. It goes against his hierarchical elitism. It's a bad analogy. It's a bad analogy. Anyway, I should crack on here. Herlock Sholmes. What was the race that was believed to have mixed with one of Frodo's ancestors? Well, Frodo, I believe, I'm going to be corrected, I'm sure, but he had Brandybuck blood in him. So he was always seen as a wee bit queer because or strange because he had that aspect to him. Did he also have a bit of Took in him? I may be making that up. But yes. Tolkien didn't read The Populist Delusion. No, indeed, he did not. He did not, and he's probably better for it, eh? Wouldn't we all be better if we didn't have to deal with the modern dismantling of all that's good, ideologically and in practice? Let's see. So, Balkan War Criminal. He may have expected Traz to take it as a wink, and maybe some nerds did, just as with his Matrix and other sci-fi references, but somewhat backfired for him. He isn't as interesting as he used to. Yeah, I think he thought it would be like a nice gimmick, but it really got in the way of what he was trying to say, and it didn't help at all. maybe in part as well, because something like the Matrix is itself trying to deconstruct the world and its, the forces within it to some degree. Whereas, if you understand the Matrix, you understand the nature of reality. The Lord of the Rings is not that kind of thing. If Yarvin is modern, Tolkien is definitely pre-modern. So the visions just don't work. It's just not compatible with what he's trying to say. Worse than that, Yarvin is Wormtongue. Do nothing. Saruman is our ally. You are weak. No, we are the Rohirrim. We are the Rohirrim, sir. Yes, we will rise. We will defeat the forces of evil. Or Sarumanery. Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, we should be charitable, right? I think he does want to overthrow the regime. He wants a more effective regime. Yeah, that's fair enough. Game of Thrones is kind of not talked about anymore. Maybe Harry Potter, but even that's kind of gone. It's interesting, isn't it? Like all these franchises which were so big, Lord of the Rings is still there, and so much so that Amazon now have to make the Rings of Power. They're trying to use that to help them make money. It's really interesting. The folk from the provinces and the countryside being compared to hobbits was what was good in Yarvin's articles. Ruling happens from the capital. So yeah, not for ordinary hobbits. Yeah, yeah, I think that's correct. But he wants to expand it to like characterize red states in general. He also wants to say it's a cultural attitude, like a pre-modern attitude to life, compared to the elves, who primarily live in blue states, who want to self-actualize. So he wants to tie a number of different things. If it was just the rural v urban, that would be fine. But he also wants to make it an attitude towards life and a geographic connection, and say that you can move between these things quite, through the power of the university. It's that doesn't necessarily work with the rural urban thing, right? So he needed just to pare it down to like one thing that he's comparing or bringing together. But that he's not a very systematic thinker. He likes to just kind of go for it, and I think that style means that he will tend to bring a lot of things in together. It makes for a really like people are able to talk a long time about his ideas because there's a certain depth, I think, like you can push into them and prod them and take them in directions and think about them. Hence, we're coming up towards 2 hours now. There's that's in it. That's impressive that his ideas could produce like a 2 hour stream. The distributors did a 3 hour stream on his ideas, and he's got many videos on them. So there's something like good there, and I think that's worth noting as well, right? Not many people today you could say that about. Some in our sphere say that culture is downstream from power. That's true as seen in instances when social engineering wins and works. What's scary is that few dark elves believe in the Tao. Yes, I mean Yarvin doesn't believe that idea, right? So you're right on that front. I think though it's a kind of chicken and egg situation. This is one of the difficulties with modern thought, which can only think in causal relationships rather than in pre-modern ideas, where for good or for ill, people could think of things existing simultaneously or coexisting in the spiritual and physical realms. So this idea that the legislation can overturn and fundamentally change culture is definitely true. We've seen that in many instances. I won't go through them all now, but let's think about that for a second. The people making the legislation already believe these ideas are important, so they've already been informed by an ideology, which they're then trying to push through the rest of the population. So there's already a certain cultural aspect working there. Now, no doubt that was brought itself in through various forms of power, but the cycle keeps going, or we could see these as parallel two sides of the same coin. And I think it's we need to think about both. We need to think about discrediting the political formula intellectually, emotionally, but also then bringing that to bear legally or through power. Yes, it does feel like we're ruled by alien octopus robots. Maybe he was revealing the truth. It's not lizards after all. It's alien octopus robots. Right, I think we're getting towards catching up with the end of the stream here. Let's see. It does sound like a punk band, yes. Yarvin shied away from something he'd consider libertarian cringe. The one ring representing power. Fundamental to elitism and anarchs is that power is unavoidable. Yes, he didn't wrestle with that idea. I don't think the ring is power itself, because Tolkien's not afraid of power. He believes that power is justified when it is in accordance with the natural order of reality. So Aragorn is the rightful king of Gondor and Arnor, so he has the right to wield power within those realms. Galadriel is the Lady of Lothlorien. She has the right to wield power within that realm. What he objects to is people like Sauron usurping power that does not belong to them. Sauron calls himself the King of Kings. That's a title that only belongs to Ilúvatar. Denethor essentially tries to usurp the throne of Gondor, and it's not his to take. Saruman tries to take Rohan. It's not his. So Tolkien's not afraid of power. So the ring, I don't think, can represent power, so much so as the temptation to take power that is not yours to have. This concept is missing from Yarvin, I think, apart from the idea of competency. You have the right to power if you are a competent elite. So it could, though, be... I'd be interested in his view on absolute power. Can we escape the idea of absolute power? Can we have a system where there is distribution of power to basically groups to be self-governing, like we find at the end of The Lord of the Rings, or not? I would see, for example, an alien octopus robot ruling the United Kingdom, ruling the Earth as usurping the rightful order. Yarvin doesn't. So he'd probably take the ring. I'm pretty sure of that. Let's see. They want us to have a violent revolution, but people know this. We are doing it peacefully by creating the new society. Let's hope so, Flora. And it's good to see you as always, my friend. Thank you, Byron Brand Stepwise. Good to see you as always. And thank you, Balkan War Criminal. No need to worry, Vingle. I think it's fun. It's fun, isn't it, right? To have a laugh about it. And I've made my fair share of comments like that. I think yeah, it's good. It's good. It's what makes this different from a lecture. It makes it better. One of the things I really enjoy about YouTube is that I get to hang out with you guys, basically, and have a conversation and have a laugh. So you don't need to apologize at all, Vingle. Wow. Shire-based racism. Yeah, an upper class associated with leisure is a better choice to describe US coastal city dwellers than beauty loving. Yes, and I think he has he has a very high opinion of himself and his culture. Let's just say that whether he's being deliberately provocative is a good point. If he is, that's cool. That would be really cool. I don't know my law on this, I'm afraid, guys. I'm ashamed to say. It's too deep for me. I'm a European, so I may be seeing parallels between the rural, urban, and red-blue divides that don't actually exist. There are parallels, right? So many of the red states do have more rural-based populations, smaller town kind of attitudes, but also the attitude of we just want to be left alone to run our lives seems quite dominant. But it just doesn't quite work the same way as you say in the European context, because you do have elites in red states. The Republican Party is a part of the system for Yarvin, which governs the United States of America. He sees it as a vital cog in the system. So even that challenges this idea to some extent. Here we go. I think it's mentioned in the prologue. The Danish word is fe. I could be wrong, but I'll see if I can find it. Okay. Let's see. He definitely talks about like the Falahides as being one group who were more adventurous and leaders amongst the hobbits. So there was a kind of ethnic, genetic origins contributed to the hierarchies of the Shire, which is, well, it goes against Yarvin's idea that it's all roles and not race, is it? I think we're getting towards, yes. Oh wait, here we go. I may be reading too much into Tolkien's anarchist letter. I know that Tolkien claimed to avoid and dislike allegory, by implication, the One Ring as power. Yeah, and I think Tolkien's heavily influenced by George MacDonald on his attitude towards literature and fantasy writing. So was C.S. Lewis. But I think Tolkien took on the idea that MacDonald had, which reading a story isn't something that should be explained by the author in great detail, the meaning of the story, because actually, story doesn't have a meaning per se, like a creed does, right? Actually, what a story does is it awakens in the reader music. That's how MacDonald would put it. You read the story and it brings something up in you, a vision of life, an idea, a thought, a feeling. And often these different readers have their own unique experience, but there's a common thread through them, depending upon their openness to the story or their history, their own lives, their experiences, etc., etc. In a sense, then allegory, seeing a story as an allegory, actually prevents that sort of thing in a way. It stops the story from having the ability to awaken a number of different perspectives upon it, which in turn how would you put it? Well, the author themselves may not see the full symphony that their work has produced, because ultimately their work is not from themselves, but actually a gift from the divine. That's how MacDonald would see it. I think Tolkien, with his idea of subcreation, sees it similarly. And something like the creation story, the Ainul and Dale, when you read it with this kind of idea that that when we're engaging with a novel, we're actually each playing a part of the symphony that novel has created. Well, the Ainur each have a part to play in bringing Iluvatar's musical designs to reality. It seems like there's an influence there from MacDonald. So I can see why he, in theory, rejected allegory, though we can read certain inspirations or ideas being represented by the ring or certain characters, right? We need not remove all possible illusions. Well, I think that has been a good stream. I think we've had a good time. I'm going to be away for the next week or so. I'm off to William Gladstone's library in Harden, which is on the border between England and Wales, which is a lovely place where many people go to do some research and writing. And I will be writing my speech for the Witten, the event that Shieldings are running this year, taking place between the 26th and 28th of August. I believe there are still some tickets left, so if you haven't already purchased one and you would like to go, check it out now, get onto it. It's going to be a really good event. Curtis Yarvin will be speaking at the event, and who knows, maybe I'll be able to probe him on his Tolkien analogy a little bit more. Others included Sargon of Akkad, Academic Agent, Alexander Adams, Panama Hat, and then a whole host of others. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to be really exciting. I'm really pumped for it. So I'll be away for a little while. I won't be around too much. And I should be back on YouTube, not on this channel, but on Apostolic Majesty's channel for the return of the Tolkien series. Till then, my friends, keep well. I hope and pray for you all that things go well over the next couple of weeks for you. And I would encourage you to go away and think a little bit more about what Yarvin said, what your own ideas are here, whether you agree with what I've said, whether there's things that you think could be teased out more, developed, improved, or even rejected. And feel free to put them in the comments. Till next we meet. God bless you all, and good night.
I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend?